Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to make a foundation chain. This is the most important part of your crochet work because your foundation chain affects all the other chains that you'll make. So you want to make these as perfect as you can. And I'll also walk you through some of the mistakes that people make with the foundation chain and how you can improve on them so that you can make sure that your work looks good. So let's get started with the basics, and then I'll also walk you through each mistake. The first step in making a foundation chain is making the slip knot. So you'll need to maybe slow down this video when you're watching it so that you can understand how exactly you do that. But this is the technique. You're going to wrap your yarn around one of your fingers, then put your thumb in there, then pull the yarn through. That's how you make a slip knot. Let's do that again. Wrap your yarn around one finger and then put your thumb through so that it looks like a circle, and then you pull the yarn through. That's a slip knot. That's the first part. So with the slip knot, you don't want to make it so tight because you want it to be like big enough for your hook to go through, but you also don't want it to be so loose. So you just go for something that's a bit tight. So I've chosen a big hook and a thick yarn so that you'll be able to follow my work easily. So once you have that, you're going to add tension. So you're going to hold part of that tail with some of your fingers, and then you're also going to create tension at the top so that it's easier for you to like pull through. So that's how you do it. You just pull through, and then you move to the second part. Like you keep adding tension so that you're able to hook the yarn, and then you pull it through, then hook the yarn, then you pull it through that space. So it's gradual. As you move, you'll also notice that I'm also moving where I'm adding the tension, so that once I work on this chain, I move my tension to the next part, and then I hook again, and then I move my tension, and then I hook again, and then I move my tension, and then I hook again, and then I move my tension, and I hook again. So that's slowly. You hook, move, hook, move, hook, and move. It's very gradual, and you want to be very patient with this process so that you're not making mistakes. As you continue and move away from being a beginner, this will be much easier. So that's it. So you'll just continue doing that until you get to the end of your chain. As you can see, it looks very uniform. The more uniform it is, the better for you. So what kind of mistakes do people make when they're making their foundation chain? Let's move through each of those mistakes. A common mistake that people make with their foundation chain is going for a very narrow space. So like if you hook, if you make the slip knot in a way that tightens around your yarn, it's going to be very hard for you to move into that space. So you'll find that you're struggling to hook your yarn, and this will not only result in inconsistency at the end of your process, but you'll also find that it's going to be very hard for you to work on the foundation chain, and it's also going to be very hard for you to work on the rest of the rows because you're going to be working with very limited space. While it's still possible to achieve consistency using such a very narrow spacing, you'll find that it makes your work just harder. If you want something that's a bit more narrow like this, you can instead work with a smaller yarn and a smaller hook, because this will be very time consuming and it's going to be harder for you to work on the other rows. So if you find that you're hooking your yarn too much, like around the hook, okay, you see it's still very consistent and neat, but it's still going to be very hard for you. So in that case, you just want to loosen this a bit so that you have some room, not too much room, but it's just enough for you to just work more naturally through that, and it's going to make your work a bit faster. So that's one mistake that you want to avoid. So let's move on to the next mistake. In contrast to working with very narrow spacing, you can also end up working with too much spacing. So you always want the spacing to be just enough for your hook to work in there. So it has some wiggle room, but it's not too much. If you go for very wide spacing, for example, let's work with that, you'll find that it's going to be giving you too much space. So let's see what that looks like. So you can see that it's wide, it's very wide. And the problem with this is that the subsequent rows will also have such wide spacing, and if you're not going for something that's loose, you'll find that the garment looks looser than usual, because when you work on the other rows, you'll find that you're still working with the same spacing that you started with at the foundation, and that can make your work look a bit too loose, and you don't want this, especially when you're working on things like maybe bikinis and hats. You want something that has like less spacing, so that it's not see-through maybe, or it doesn't look loose, or it doesn't just look a bit, I don't know, loose fitting, ill fitting, and all of those other issues. So you just don't want to work with something that's so loose. While it's still possible to have consistency when you're working with something that's very loose, it doesn't look very nice. In some cases it looks nice for maybe a cardigan, but if you're not going for something like that, you also want to work on your foundation row so that it's not so loose. So that's another mistake. Let's move on to the third one. Another common mistake with the foundation row is inconsistency, such that maybe I start with a wide one here, and then the next one I go for a small one, and then the next one I go for a wide one, and then the next one maybe I still go wide, and then I go small, then I go wide, and then I go wide, and then I go small. So usually this inconsistency, my goodness, the inconsistency will affect your subsequent rows, such that when you come to work on the first chain, you'll find that sometimes your garment looks tight, sometimes it looks loose, and you'll have a hard time managing just how much like the spacing is between the rows, and this comes from your foundation row. But usually you'll find that the inconsistency also comes from the lack of consistent tension. So if you're working on tension, make sure you're moving. As you move to another chain, you also move your tension, so that if you're working wide, you work wide. If you're working narrow, you keep moving, and you keep moving with the same tension that you are applying to the previous rows, so that at the end you have consistent work. Sometimes you don't have to move after every chain, depending on how much tension you're using, but you also have to make sure that you're using the same tension for each chain. So if you're moving with like such tension that gives you a narrow results, you move with the same tension. If you're working for something that's a bit thicker, you work with the same tension. You don't want to keep alternating your tension, because this will also affect the look of your foundation row in the subsequent rows. So you just keep that in mind. So those are some of the mistakes that you make when you're making your foundation row. And like I said, your foundation row is like the foundation of a building. If you start with a bad foundation, what you do, like when you're working on the rest of the floors, will also be affected by what you did when you started. So try as much as you can to have consistency when you're starting your rows, and then that will help you come up with neat work. For more tutorials on how to work on crochet, you can look at my playlist, which offers you tons of tutorials on the same, as well as designs that you can use. I hope this was helpful. If it helped you work on your technique, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. Thank you.